Professor Mthende Mhango, you made a point earlier on that as far as you're concerned, this is a political matter. Please develop that point for us if you may.
Yes, Olani, the reason I say this is because in terms of this challenge, what essentially those who are opposed to this tolling system are saying is that government did not properly consult and did not consider other alternative models, and therefore the decision was irrational. Now, what a court can essentially do is it can simply, if persuaded by that argument, it can simply ask the government to go back and reconsider and come back. It is not for the court to disagree. The court can disagree with the rationale of the government, but it cannot invalidate its decision on that basis. Now, what that means to me is that if the opponents win in the second round, is essentially they will get a ruling that says, government, you need to go back and reconsider. And the government come back with the same outcome, the court cannot do anything. Now, I say it's political because in terms of our constitution, these processes of engaging the public and getting public participation are not designed to dictate to government what decisions they should take. They're simply designed to alert and allow government to take into considerations the fears, the political fears, as to the decision that they're about to take. As far as how the government responds to those fears, the Constitution gives that authority to the government to make those decisions. So we cannot force the government to take a different outcome in the courts. All we can do in the courts is to have the government come back with a different view. Politically, however, you can persuade government to take a different position. Here, I think what is happening is essentially that it's an unpopular decision, and unpopular decisions will essentially have to, they have to get themselves heard within the political circles of our state.
So in other words, what you're saying is that the next move, the next step will be a political step.
I'm saying that this matter should have been dealt with in the political circles in the first place, because all what the court can do is can delay the process, but they cannot delay the inevitable, which is that government wants to move on with this. But if government decides not to move, it will only be persuaded by the political risks that are associated with this decision.
Does it make sense to you then that on Thursday, COSATU and the ANC made the kind of decision that they made, of course preempting the decision by the court on Saturday?
I think that decision was an important one, and I think it should have happened months ago. And I think that is where the lobbying should have been happening, at the political level, and not through the courts. Because a court, put it this way, if I was Judge Prince Roo, I have an argument that says this is irrational. I have another argument that says if you allow this interdict, government is going to face an enormous economic financial burden. All those arguments, to me, are not legal arguments, because government make decisions that have financial burdens all the time. The other argument that the opponents of this tolling are making is that it is impossible for them to actually collect all the tolls to finance this project. But if you think about it, with these cameras that you see on the roads, when you're driving on those, and there's somebody driving 10 meters behind you, if you get, if the camera takes a picture of you violating the speed limit, the person 5 or 10 minutes behind you is not going to be captured, because technically that machine cannot capture that person. But you cannot say that we must scrap the camera system because they are not getting the person behind you. I mean, that's an irrational argument in itself. So Judge Prince Roo, I think, was in a very difficult position to make a decision that essentially should be resolved out there in the political process.
All right, let me bring in Lebohang on that score then. Lebohang, I'm not sure, firstly, if you agree that this decision should have been made at a political level. If you do, then what does it mean for the political players? What are the implications for the political players who then would have failed or deferred a decision to the courts?
Well, this is the manner of our governance at the moment, in which we're using the judiciary increasingly to try and resolve our political contradictions. And I think that the previous speaker has made a point that is very important in terms of citizens' participation and public participation and engagement in this issue, the process at which it should have and could have happened, and the fact that the legal process has now become a last resort in order to resolve a dilemma and a deficit in a process that should have taken place far sooner. I think that there are a few things that when we look at this sort of issue that we must consider. We must consider the fact that, number one, there are any decision of this nature, which is dealing with the public good, it should really ideally improve economic inclusion. And it should also improve their ability to do business affordably and for the consumers not to take the greatest burden. And other countries have had to deal with this sort of thing, particularly Southeast Asia, after they emerged from their meltdown about 10 years ago. They would not have dared to impose yet another tax upon an already recovering and upon an already disenfranchised broad population and citizenry. The other thing as well that's linked to this is the notion of risk management. Risk is not only about financial risk and economic, it's also about economic risk. It is also about the risk of the kind of action that we have seen right now that has understandably and quite correctly stalled a process. We also have to look at things around commercial projects and the way that they lead to economies of scale. We should also look at the fact that whatever model is chosen must link in with the mandate to improve service delivery. As per the New Growth Path, even previously as per ESGISA, there's a whole bunch of stuff, and there's a whole bunch of policy instruments which support the notion that we must build an inclusive economy, and also the industrial policy action plan. So in effect, government seems to have acted against its own good intentions, and I think that this is where we have a very problematic situation. And I suppose that these are some of the dilemmas that we are now having to deal with.
Let me just again ask you to establish that point a little bit about government having to, at least appearing to have acted against its own intentions here. Government says, we now have highways. We have beautiful highways, free and flowing and so on. And therefore, somebody had to pay for that. Somebody has to pay for that.
Somebody must pay, and I suppose that, when we looked at the sort of funding models and the cross-subsidization models that at our disposal, there are two things about the somebody must pay, Xolani, and the listeners, which we need to unpack. Who is the somebody? Why must they pay? And what is their return on investment? And I suppose really when we look at them, I think for a nation that has just emerged from paying for a World Cup, a soccer bonanza, the Gautrain, for example, might have been viewed as a non-essential public good. One might argue that it's not even a public good because its access and its coverage is actually quite limited to middle-class areas. And yet we were not in any way asked to cross-subsidize that particular endeavor. So I think that when we look at the kind of funding models that our government has recently applied, we can see that there are alternatives. Sure. And I think that as well, when we say that somebody must pay, yes, indeed, somebody must pay. In this instance, we also need to think about productivity. We must think about whether it should be the tolling companies who must pay, the international companies who are clearly getting the greatest return investment, or whether it's the consumers, people like us, and local businesses and local industries who will have to be penalized.
All right. Mr. Ntshalintshali, I want to pursue with you the issue of politics here. David Ward says to me what he sees is a low-level tax revolt. Would you concur?
I agree with the previous speakers that this matter boils both to question of political and legal in our case. It's not a question of just engaging in politics, and I think we'll have made a bigger case even in terms of the legal matters, which we hope, of course, we agree with the others that the space given now by the court in terms of the interim relief give us a space to negotiate.
So would you say that it was a failure of a political process that led to this matter ending up in court?
Both is a question of the oversight from the minister. In fact, his ability to engage publicly. But also, as you know, Xolani, that all socio-economic matters, before they become the policy, has to be tabled in NEDLAC. This matter was never tabled in NEDLAC. It got a huge socio-economic implication. But also in the engagement, and as you know, that the decision to postpone it even at the political level came at this 11 hour. There have been an engagement from our side to say we must sit down, we must talk on this matter. We think it was wrong.
How should the ANC be treating this matter now? Because if we all agree that it was the failure of the political process, who then should take the blame? Is it the ANC?
It has to be. I mean, if it's the government and the ANC is the leading party in government, it should take that blame. I mean, there is no separation of a ruling party in government and the ANC as a political party. It has to give direction. It has to say how this matter should be resolved to each official who supposedly take the mandate from the ANC.
Because the ANC, up until Thursday, was still steadfast against the fact that this will continue, that this has to continue. So that was a political mistake, you say, on the part of the ANC?
Look, it depends. Some papers have indicated over the weekend that SANRAL misled the minister. And if that is the case, it goes on that then the minister misled the ANC.
What would you like then to see happen to this thing going forward in Jalinjali? Would you like it to be completely scrapped?
Look, to us, the question of the user payer in this case, we think is a wrong model because it's a commodification of our roads, and those people who have no means of paying for these things, they will be excluded from the roads. And we think it's a very, both political and socio-economic, is a very wrong approach. Our view is that we all pay tax and our money is being held by government on our behalf, and therefore government taxes should be able to pay to these things. And we can look to a model of funding that government has to find a way of raising money, but the responsibility in terms of maintaining our roads should lie squarely on the shoulders of government.